January 31, 1945. Inside the hot hangar at Clark Air Base, Major Frank T. McCoy lifted an inspection panel and saw what no Allied pilot had expected to find in an intact enemy bomber: thin aluminium fuel cells, raw seams, not a trace of self-sealing rubber or armor. That single sight answers the loud, quiet question of the Pacific War. How did an aircraft that could reach any point on the map also become a furnace for its crews? This is not a story of mechanical failure. It is a story of choices, of men in Nagoya and Tokyo who counted kilometers the way others count coins, and of the young sailors and airmen who trusted those sums with their lives. To hear this from the losing side is to feel a different kind of grief. The engineers who drew the G4M's lines were proud technicians who learned in German workshops and worked under a navy that demanded extreme range. Factory foremen watched scarce steel and rubber diverted to other needs. Pilots and bomb aimers wrote letters home in which courage and doubt shared the same line. Their language is not defeat alone. It is the tight human calculus of obligation, the belief that reaching farther would protect islands, families, an empire. When Allied crack squadrons began to cut them down, those beliefs did not dissolve into blame so much as into a slow recognition that their nation had paid for reach with flesh. Major McCoy's photograph is a ledger page. The G4M's empty weight, the liters of fuel carried in exposed tanks, the missing plates of armor, each number is a human ledger entry. Yet numbers do not capture the ritual of leaving at dawn, the smell of oil and sea, the quiet jokes before takeoff that tried to make courage routine. They do not hold the faces who climbed into the Betty because duty, rank, and culture asked them to go. Stay with this story. We will trace the bomber from the first bright raids that stunned navies, through the slow revelation of its fatal design, to missions that became seals of fate. In the end, the most painful question will not be how the war was lost, but how a people counted what they were willing to burn for distance, and what that burning left behind. January 31, 1945. Major Frank T. McCoy pried back an inspection panel on the wing of a Mitsubishi G4M, and the light from the Philippine sun poured into a small, terrible truth. Fuel tanks made of thin aluminium, raw seams, no rubber lining to swell and seal when pierced, no armor plates, no suppression systems. He stood very still. This was not a crashed hulk picked over in jungle mud. This was a complete bomber, parked on its tricycle gear like a sleeping animal, abandoned by people who had once trusted it with their lives. The discovery was simple and absolute. It answered a quiet, terrible question about the Pacific War. How could an aircraft so capable of reaching any map point at once become a furnace for its crews? Imagine the men who made that choice. Not villains. Men at drafting tables in Nagoya, sleeves stained with grease, coffee cooling beside inked drawings. Kiro Honjo had been to Germany, studied Junker's methods, and returned with a clear idea. To meet the Japanese Navy's demand for range, something had to give. The Navy asked for an attack bomber that could cross vast ocean distances, arrive high and fast, drop weighty torpedoes and bombs, and return. Materials were scarce, industry strained. Rubber and armor cost kilograms, and shells and bullets cost lives. Honjo and his team tallied fuel weights against protection. Each kilogram of sealing compound or plate meant fewer liters of fuel or a smaller payload. They saw their work as service. Make the machine that obeys orders. Let others decide how to use it. Now imagine the men who flew it, young officers in flight suits, hair still smelling of fuel, writing short, precise letters home. They learned the bomber in wind and salt. They learned a culture that prized duty over complaint. When they lifted from Rabaul toward Guadalcanal or from Formosa toward Luzon, they carried more than bombs. They carried a belief that striking far would protect the islands, protect families by time. That belief hardened into routine. Jokes were told in the dark. A hand on a shoulder before engine start. The small, human rituals by which people make courage less sharp. On December 8, 1941, those routines turned into sudden violence. 82 G4Ms climbed from Formosa and took the sky toward Luzon. At 20,000 feet, they were beyond American anti-aircraft range, and with surprise, they turned Clark Field into fire in 45 minutes. Runways shattered. P-40 Warhawks lay in burning heaps. Lieutenant James Harrington would later write how the formation came in perfect. how fighters dropped low and tore the surviving aircraft on the ground. For a while, the bomber's reach looked like salvation. It turned maps into advantage. It allowed Japan to strike in places the Allies had presumed safe. It allowed attacks on Darwin, Port Moresby, and later on naval forces at sea. There was a darker ledger behind those early victories. The decisions made in Nagoya and Tokyo were choices about what to value: range, speed, and offensive power, and what to leave to fate. The G4M's empty weight, the liters of fuel carried in exposed tanks, the lack of armor, they were numbers. But numbers write the destiny of people. A kilogram of rubber not installed meant a kilogram of someone's chance for survival, not taken. Factory managers who shaved millimeters off a tank seam did not watch the bomber fall in flames. Pilots and gunners did. For the losing side, the story carries a particular kind of grief. There is the public record of strategy and the private ledger of faces. In the towns near Nagoya, foremen counted output and felt pride. They had produced an aircraft that served the empire. In forward airfields, line mechanics polished propellers and told their sons that the bomber was a marvel. They were proud and fearful in the same breath. Then the losses began to mount. Guadalcanal was a mirror that turned the bomber's virtues into their opposite. On August 8, 1942, 23 G4Ms left Rabaul for a strike on Guadalcanal. 18 did not return. Reports from American pilots described a horrible certainty. The Betty would ignite with only a few hits. They called it the one-shot lighter. Japanese crews called it by no nickname. They knew too well the sound of fuel-feeding flame. That dichotomy, machine brilliance and human cost, is at the heart of this account. It is easy to list technical specifications: a top speed around 428 km/h, a maximum range over 6,000 km on paper, a crew of 7. It is harder to hold the smell of burned leather and hair in memory, to read a maintenance log, and then a mother's letter. The engineers wrote efficiency into metal. The crews wrote bravery into logbooks. Between them lay orders and doctrine, and between doctrine and outcome lay chance, tactics, and the growing power of the Allies. When Allied technicians began to examine captured and intact G4Ms, their hands found the same design everywhere. Fuel tanks in the wing center, unprotected and thin. Access panels that revealed no rubber layers that would swell when punctured. No compartmentalization to isolate burning cells. The discovery was not an accident of war damage. It was design. Allied engineers, hardened by years of their own armored bombers and self-sealing tanks, saw a deliberate sacrifice of protection for range. To them, the math was devastatingly clear. The Japanese had saved 500 kilograms or more by omitting protection. Those kilos bought thousands of kilometers of reach. They also bought a near certainty of fiery death when the bomber met competent interception. That thought pressed on the mind in personal ways. How did a father pilot face his children when he knew his aircraft carried no protection? How did a young mechanic explain to his sister that what he welded mattered to strategy and to survival in very different measures? And how did the men who made the choices live with those choices as bodies returned and names were read? These are not rhetorical puzzles only. They are lived conflicts inside the losing nation. Duty versus doubt, honor versus survival, obedience versus the private knowledge of what that obedience cost. The intact bomber at Clark Field spoke in clicks and grease marks and plate rivets. Major McCoy's photographs recorded geometry and condition. His technical reports recorded numbers and diagrams. But the true record lay in the small things: a thermos left in the cockpit, a folded pair of gloves in a compartment, a cigarette butt crushed in the ashtray. These belonged to people who walked away from an airframe designed to carry them home and yet left them exposed in the sky. Why had this particular aircraft been abandoned whole? Perhaps the crew fled before the ground forces arrived. Perhaps they walked away when the American advance made the airfield untenable. Their survival was a narrow exception in a larger pattern of loss. Most of the crews who flew the Betty did not walk away. Questions emerge and refuse easy answers. Did Japanese leaders believe the reach they demanded would be decisive and quick enough that losses would be acceptable? Did factory managers imagine the scale of casualties that would come? Did pilots believe they would be replaced by heroism rather than numbers? Each question opens another. What did the men who designed the bomber expect when they wrote specifications in 1937? What did those who launched the raids in 1941 expect when the early months of the war brought success? And when the Allies learned and adapted, when fighters improved and radar and tactics closed windows that had once been open, at what point did the costs of the design become obvious to the men who had made it? These questions generate conflict in small scenes that linger. A meeting in Nagoya where engineers argue over rubber shortages, a pre-flight prayer in a tent as young men prepare to fly a mission that last week would have been a triumph. A mechanic who knows a seam is marginal and chooses to fly anyway because orders are orders, and failing to fly will be judged worse than risking death. These are the micro-conflicts that make history humanly urgent. They are not resolved in reports. They echo through letters and graves. Major McCoy's discovery is a hinge. It connects the early dazzling reach to the later attrition. It makes visible the ledger entries that were otherwise abstract. Kilos saved, liters carried, men lost. From that hinge, one branch runs back to the raids that shocked navies and airfields. The other runs forward to missions that proved impossible and to policy debates that, had they happened earlier and in different places, might have changed outcomes. The bomber's gleam in the sun at Clark was beautiful, but its beauty was a pact, a trade made in ink and fuel that would ask a steep price. You will want to know what that trade bought for Japan in concrete terms. You will want the precise narratives of the attacks that turned seas into graves, and the missions where the Betty's reach allowed Japan to strike far. You will want the human cost told in faces and numbers together, and you will want to understand the men who decided, who ordered, who flew, and who died. We will follow those threads into the next part, where the Betty's range rewrote naval calculations, and where early triumphs would throw a long shadow over what came after. For now, hold the image of the intact wing and remember the seam's thinness. The question is urgent. When a nation makes distance its highest value, what does it leave unprotected? And who pays the bill? December 10th, 1941. In less than 90 minutes, the sea swallowed two of Britain's proudest ships, and the world watched a new rule of power being written from above. For men in Nagoya and Tokyo, for crews who had climbed into the Betty at dawn, the strikes at Clark and then against Force Z felt like vindication. All the sacrifices at the drawing board, every kilogram counted, and every missing plate of armor, suddenly had a meaning that glowed in the headlines and the faces of triumphant officers. They had given their navy reach. They had turned islands and coasts that once seemed safe into targets within hours. Picture a map spread across a table. On it, a small black dot in Formosa becomes a launching point that redraws the blue lines of the Pacific. The G4M could fly farther than any bomber Japan had before. That distance mattered like money in a bank that could buy you time and options. In the days after Pearl Harbor and Clark Field, Tokyo's leaders felt that distance as confidence. They watched the pictures sent back from Clark. Runways broken, American fighters burned where they stood. They watched the film from the attacks on Prince of Wales and Repulse as torpedoes struck. Steel tore open, and modern naval doctrine seemed to fail. To the men who had built the Betty, each success was a quiet answer to 1,000 small, anxious questions they had asked themselves while sketching lines and balancing weights. But this sense of triumph was personal, as much as strategic. A foreman in a Mitsubishi plant would drink his tea and shake hands with his crew when a new batch rolled out. He might think of his own son, perhaps in a uniform, and take comfort that the machine his men made could reach and strike where the enemy thought they were safe. A pilot who grew up along the coast could imagine defending his home islands by striking first and forcing the enemy to respond. These are the human judgments that feel immediate and real. Think for a moment about a decision you make in daily life. Buying a car that has great fuel economy because you drive long distances, even if it means skimping on expensive extras. The logic is the same. Trade-offs are made in ordinary choices every day. You accept less comfort or safety for greater range or savings because you believe the benefit will protect you in the long run. For Japan's planners, the map promised security in exchange for those small technical sacrifices. The attack on Force Z carried a geopolitical shock. Two capital ships, the newest and most prestigious of their kind, went down while trying to maneuver against aircraft they could not bring down. The Type 91 aerial torpedoes, engineered to run in shallow water and to hit the hulls where they would do the most damage, found their marks. Whole traditions of naval pride, steel armor, heavy guns, gunnery crews, felt suddenly inadequate in the face of aircraft that could reach them from hundreds of miles away. For the Japanese Navy, this was proof that aircraft could not only escort and scout for fleets, but could, with proper range, unmake a fleet in the open sea. Men who had argued for more fuel and less armor at meetings felt justified. For a time, the choice felt like salvation. Yet even in that moment of success, there were private frictions. An engineer who had spent nights calculating center of gravity might look at the photographs and wonder if the ledger balanced. A squadron leader who had lost friends on later missions would carry the early victory like a weight. On the docks in Singapore, sailors cheered the news and later would whisper about the sorties that never returned. These small dissonances show how victory can sit uncomfortably beside fear. Victory does not erase anxiety. It sometimes hides it. Think of a family saving money for a distant, important goal. College, a house, medical care. The parents economize, skip pleasures, and tell themselves the sacrifice is for a secure future. If the future looks bright because of a sudden success, a promotion, a windfall, the sacrifices feel justified. But what if the circumstances change and the sacrifices become permanent losses? That is the slow, bitter lesson that would haunt the G4M story. Early in the war, range was a strategic windfall. But windfalls can trick the senses into believing that the world will stay the same. And war changes the world fast. The Japanese may have won the first chapters, but the reach that made those wins possible also created a new dependence. Bases had to be maintained at long distances, supply lines stretched, and crews were forced into long, exhausting missions across open ocean. The bomber's ability to project power from a distant airfield meant that the Navy had to accept logistic exposure in return. Men in forward bases learned the geography of fatigue. Pilots and crews returned from 1,000-mile trips exhausted, engines hot, and aircraft sometimes pushed beyond comfort. The machine that had promised to keep the Empire safe demanded long flights and relentless maintenance. It asked more of people than a shorter-range design would ever have needed. From the Allied side, the reaction was urgent. Where admirals had once counted on the safety of the sea, they were forced to plan for air attacks that could reach them far from land. Naval strategy changed overnight. Convoys, fighter patrols, and radar became priorities. Where possible, carriers and fighters were moved to cover gaps. The Allies began the laborious process of closing the distances that Japanese bombers could exploit. Technology and production could change the map, but those changes took time. For months, the G4M's range was a real operational advantage that was exploited in strikes on Darwin, Port Moresby, and beyond. Those raids damaged infrastructure and killed many, and they forced the Allies to rebuild their positions under pressure. Meanwhile, in the messy human places behind the strategy, homes, workshops, hospitals, the toll started to show. Newspapers in Japanese towns printed lists of the missing, with a matter-of-factness that hid private ruin. Mothers learned to ask whether a son's name on a list meant a body recovered or a grave at sea. Clerks at naval offices tallied sorties and losses, and gradually realized that attrition could outpace production. For viewers today, that contrast is not hard to imagine. We all know what it is to work hard for a short-term gain that creates long-term vulnerability. A business that cuts maintenance to save money now, only to face a costly failure later. A driver who delays tire replacement and risks a blowout. The psychology is universal. Accept risk now to achieve a gain that may or may not endure. On the bridges where strategy met supply, men argued in private. Supply officers begged for more rubber and armor. Commanders argued that operational reach could be extended with a network of bases and fuel depots. They planned, as planners always do, for conditions to remain favorable. But war is a restless teacher. The Allies did not remain static. Fighter design improved, pilot training intensified, and radar networks expanded. As the balance of skills and technology shifted, the early advantage of range would begin to wobble. Alongside these larger movements were intimate stories that made the abstract real. A young mechanic named Hiroshi might have polished the propeller of a new Betty and joked with a pilot about the distance he could now fly home to see his family. A captain on a cruiser sunk by torpedo fire would leave a wife and a stack of unpaid bills. Families traded triumphal telegrams for the quiet work of burying their dead. The human ledger never balanced in the way an engineer's calculation can. Those stories create an emotional currency that persists beyond statistics. The early successes also had a diplomatic effect. countries watching the Pacific saw an imperial force capable of striking far. Some naval commanders recalculated alliance commitments. For Britain, the loss of Prince of Wales and Repulse was a shock that reverberated through Southeast Asia. For the Americans, the fall of Clark and the vulnerability of forward airfields demanded a strategic response that would eventually reshape their approach to carrier operations, island hopping, and air defense. This is the precise moment in the story where triumph begins to harden into dilemma. The choices that felt intelligent when written on paper now lived as daily routines of supply and risk. Men who had approved the specifications saw their work tested not in clean engineering terms, but in human ones: faces, letters, and grave markers. The forward edge of the empire had expanded, but with expansion came longer lines and thinner shelter. If you are following these stories, you may want to know how the unimaginable costs began to pile up. You will want to watch how the Allies adapted, and how the same design choices that had delivered such power also made certain missions dangerous to the point of madness. You will want to hear voices of the men who flew and built these planes, not just read the numbers. If you want to keep following the human truth behind the machines, click the red button in the corner now and subscribe. Join others who want to see the untold faces behind history. One click makes sure you will not miss the next chapter, where success meets the hard edge of combat, and we begin to see why the G4M's brilliant reach would become a funeral pyre for so many. Don't miss the next episode. There are stories you will not hear anywhere else, and they deserve to be remembered. The maps that showed early Japanese advantage also began to show thin lines where supply had to flow and where pilots had to gamble with their lives. The question that will follow us into the next part is simple and terrible. When distance has been bought at the price of protection, how long will that debt remain payable? August 8, 1942. The morning began like any other at Rabaul. Crews checking gauges, pilots sipping tea, groundmen joking to hide the cold of a long campaign. They climbed into the G4Ms, knowing the distance they must fly and the weight they carried. They knew the maps and the orders. What they did not fully know was how quickly a bomber could become an inferno. Within hours over Savo Island, a formation of 23 Bettys was met by American fighters. 18 were gone, the sky filled with burning metal and falling men. For the survivors, the noise of engines became the sound of a verdict. Allied pilots began to tell the same story after each engagement. A few hits to wing or fuselage, and the bomber would erupt in flame as if a match had been dropped into a barrel of gasoline. They christened the aircraft with names that captured their horror: Flying Zippo, One Shot Lighter. Those names stuck because they described not a quirk but a pattern. Each dogfight, each interception, reinforced the same grim truth. The Betty's brilliance at range had cost it a single fatal weakness: exposed fuel that turned small damage into certain death. The human cost was immediate and terrible. In a single mission, hundreds of trained men vanished. Squadron rosters that had been full the week before read thin and broken afterwards. Letters home stopped arriving. For families in Japan, a telegram could carry little detail and enormous grief. For the men on base, grief mixed with a hardening acceptance. They learned new rituals, tighter formation discipline, prayers said quickly and without ceremony, small gifts tucked into pockets before takeoff. Duty did not erase fear. It taught men how to live with the knowledge that survival was often a matter of luck. Back in Allied technical rooms, the pilots' reports were matched to wreckage. At Buna in November 1942, engineers crawled into wrecked Bettys and into hidden parts of the wing and found what the pilots had described. Fuel cells were aluminum shells, perhaps 2 millimeters thick. No layered rubber that swelled to seal a puncture. No armor, no isolation. The tank sat in the thick part of the wing because that provided volume and structural strength, but it also placed fuel where enemy fire most often struck. The technicians did not call it negligence. They called it deliberate design. What does a nation choose when it writes a plane by arithmetic more than by mercy? As Allied fighters grew in number and quality, tactics evolved fast. Early Wildcats were replaced and supplemented by Corsairs and Hellcats that had superior speed, climb, and firepower. Pilots learned to aim not only for the engines, but for the wing routes where fuel tanks lay. Intercept patterns shifted from sweeping passes to focused attacks that forced the Betty into defensive maneuvers it was not built to perform. The math on the drafting table, kilos saved for range, translated to a simple battlefield fact. Once intercepted by modern fighters, the G4M was likely to burn. Japanese crews faced a psychological erosion that numbers could not show. The first missions with the Betty had felt like proof, long-range strikes that could move the lines of war. But repeated losses wore on morale in a different way than defeat in battle alone. Men who survived one fiery crash watched friends die in similar ways within weeks. The ritual of leaving a letter with a name in a cockpit became common. Some pilots kept small trinkets from home tucked near their radios. Others wrote short apologies. Courage remained, but it became edged with dread. The sense that you were part of a machine that made survival improbable changed how men spoke and how they planned to die. On the other side, Allied airmen felt a brutal ambivalence. They had learned to hate the enemy in combat, and they had named the plane with contemptuous jokes. Yet many realized the enemy crews were often young, scared, and forced into a role by an industrial and cultural system. After the heat of battle, accounts from both sides sometimes showed this recognition. An American pilot who had shot down a Betty might later speak of the silence in the cockpit before the flame. A Japanese mechanic might write about the quiet pride he felt in making each bolt true. The human overlap did not make the fighting less deadly, but it added a layer of sorrow to the tactical record. Japanese engineers tried to answer the problem with incremental fixes. Beginning in March 1943, some aircraft received thin rubber sheets under the wings where the tanks sat. These sheets were not true self-sealing tanks. They were a compromise designed to slow leakage and buy time. The change cost speed, about 9 kilometers per hour, and reduced maximum range, but it did not end the fires. The rubber could slow a leak from a small caliber bullet, but it could not stop a tracer setting vapor alight or a cannon shell tearing through multiple cells. At the factories, men who had once celebrated the Betty's reach now argued in hushed tones about whether the aircraft's purpose could be saved by patches or whether it was a fundamental mismatch of doctrine and reality. How do you fix a design that was chosen because the alternative would have been to fail the mission it was built for? The late war Model 3 attempted a deeper fix with genuine self-sealing tanks, but it arrived too late and in too small a number to change the course of things. Production constraints, bombing of Japanese industry, and the shifting priorities toward fighters meant the Model 3 could not be produced at scale. The earlier choices had multiplied losses to the point where replacement was impossible. The G4M story became a cautionary ledger. Design trade-offs are not abstract. They pay out in men's lives. The battlefield effects led to strategic reverberations. Once the Allies could intercept Betty formations with regularity, Japanese planners found their long-range bomber force increasingly useless in daylight operations against prepared defenders. Missions that had once been daring and effective became costly and at times futile. The Japanese Navy still needed reach, but the air war's momentum had moved. The Allies were learning, gaining range of their own, and steadily improving tactics and equipment. The Betty, for all its early triumphs, found itself up against an enemy that was learning faster than Japan could adapt its manufacturing and doctrine. What does it feel like to watch your nation's best tool become the very thing that destroys its strength? Personal stories make the arithmetic visceral. Masao Sato flew 28 missions in a Betty before moving to a training role. He later wrote bluntly, "The Betty was a magnificent aircraft that asked us to die for its range." That line cuts through propaganda and excuses. It is not a judgment made with the clarity of hindsight alone. It is the voice of someone who lived the compromise. Other voices echo. A mechanic who refused to accept that a patch would save a friend, a young pilot who kept a photograph of his baby tucked in a radio panel, fathers who balanced pride in the machine with private dread. Those human notes are the weight of the story. As attrition mounted, production could not keep pace. Mitsubishi's factories, once humming at nearly 100 airframes a month, faltered under bombing and shortages. The human toll could not be replaced. By late 1943 and into 1944, the number of operational Bettys dwindled. Losing men became more acute, because experience could not be replaced as quickly as machines. The very thing designed for reach had hollowed the force that needed it most. So the pattern becomes clear and tragic. Tactical brilliance followed by a slow, relentless attrition that was both mechanical and moral. Each mission asked crews to accept a high probability of death for a chance to change the map. Each engineering choice that gave range took away measures that might have kept men alive when chance failed. The result was not simple failure. It was a complex collapse where victories and losses fed into one another, until the original calculation that range would save the empire proved tragically wrong. When a nation builds machines to answer the needs of strategy, how should it weigh the life of each crew against the kilometers bought on a map? Nagoya, late 1930s. A drawing board lit by a single lamp. Kiro Honjo leans over blueprints with a cigarette stubbed and a pencil line waiting for a correction. The Navy has given him an impossible order. Build a bomber that can cross the empty ocean, find an enemy fleet or base, strike, and return. There is no budget for luxuries. Materials are scarce. Every extra kilogram is a lost kilometer. Honjo knows the math as clearly as any prayer. Fuel is heavy, armor is heavier. The shipyards cannot be everywhere. If Japan is to hold an empire of islands and sea lanes, the bomber must reach far. He signs the specification, and the G4M is born. Numbers follow decisions. The G4M Model 1 empty weight is about 6,741 kilograms. Full of fuel, it carries roughly 4,780 liters, about 3,800 kilograms of fuel, giving a maximum range that on paper stretches beyond 6,000 kilometers. Its two 14-cylinder radial engines deliver the speed the Navy requested. But those numbers hide the price. Omitting self-sealing fuel tanks, omitting significant armor, saving more than 500 kilograms by those omissions, these are not technical mistakes. They are choices baked into every joint and rivet. In Nagoya, the engineers did not imagine the moment when the enemy would have both range and fighters that could close the sky. They calculated for a strategic environment built on surprise and initiative. They believed that reaching first and hitting hard could replace the safety of armor. This is the losing side's sorrow. A plan that worked brilliantly at first, then revealed its cost in blood. Early in the war, the payoff was real. The G4M could strike targets no other bomber in the region could reach. It turned islands into forward guns, changed naval calculations, and sank ships from the air. The craft fulfilled its specification. For those who drew it, for those who assembled it, for those who pushed it out of hangars, pride mixed with the private thought that they had done their duty under directives from above. Pride, however, is a thin skin when the enemy adapts. Unexpected facts at times cut through the narrative like a cold wind. The Type 91 torpedo the Betty carried to attack ships weighed 840 kilograms with a 205-kilogram warhead and was specially designed to run shallow. The G4M could carry such torpedoes for hundreds of miles, yet the same wing that held that torpedo also held fuel tanks directly in the path of enemy fire. The engineers had placed tanks in the wing center because that section had structural depth and could store more fuel, a rational choice for range. But that very placement made them a target during interception. In plain terms, the choices that increased capability also raised vulnerability. Combat proved the equation. By mid-1942, Allied fighters arrived in numbers and with aircraft that outclassed earlier types. The Wildcat would be followed by the Corsair and Hellcat, each with better speed, firepower, and the ability to reach intercepts across the water. Pilots learned the anatomy of the Betty. Aim for the wing roots, the center section, the seams that would rupture. A few rounds, often of small caliber, could punch a hole that meant a stream of fuel, vapor, ignition, and a rapid spread of flame. The result was repeated accounts from Allied pilots of Bettys erupting into fire with almost no warning. Those who fought against them named the machine in contempt and horror: flying cigar, one-shot lighter. Such names were shorthand for a terrifying truth. Behind these accounts are human details that statistics cannot hold. The Betty's crews wrote precise notes in cramped logbooks. They tucked small photographs in the cockpit and joked about pastry shops near base before a mission. They also kept a ritual letter hidden in the aircraft. The short note left in case the bomber did not return. This was not mere fatalism. It was a culture learning to cope with a design that made survival partly a roll of probabilistic dice. Flight Petty Officer Masao Sato later summed it in a line that has the weight of confession. The Betty was a magnificent aircraft that asked us to die for its range. That sentence carries both admiration and a quiet reproach. Technicians sought fixes. In March 1943, Some production runs began placing 30mm rubber sheeting beneath the wing surfaces where tanks sat. It was a minimal self-protection measure, cheap, light, and easy to retrofit. It reduced top speed by about 9 km per hour and trimmed maximum range by roughly 315 km. It was better than nothing, yet it did not close the wound. The rubber could slow leakage from rifle or small machine gun rounds, but it could not prevent fires started by larger shells or tracer ignitions. Later, the G4M Model 3 incorporated true self-sealing tanks, but those came in tiny numbers, perhaps 60 to 90 aircraft, and only late in 1944. By then, Allied air superiority and the pace of attrition had already erased the early advantages. The attempted engineering corrections arrived too late. The loss rates carried global echoes. Mitsubishi produced about 2,400 G4Ms across variants, an enormous output for Japan's limited industrial base. Yet even with that production, the bomber force could not absorb the attrition. Compare the Allied industrial landscape. The United States produced roughly 12,531 B-17 Flying Fortresses and about 18,182 B-24 Liberators. Those figures are not just numbers. They represent a capacity to accept a different kind of design philosophy, one that prioritized crew protection and redundancy, even at the cost of weight and production complexity. American doctrine treated trained crews as strategic assets to be preserved. Japanese doctrine, shaped by geography, industrial limits, and strategic assumptions, placed a premium on reach that sometimes sacrificed men to the map. The human consequences of these choices are seen in stark episodes that changed the course of war and carried symbolic meaning with them. On April 18, 1943, Allied signals intelligence intercepted a message that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Combined Fleet and one of Japan's most revered strategists, would be making an inspection tour. He would travel by G4M with fighter escort. The interception of that message, a triumph of code-breaking, set in motion one of the war's most precise operations. 18 P-38 Lightnings flew low over 400 miles of ocean to achieve the timing required. Only 16 reached the rendezvous point because of mechanical and takeoff problems. At roughly 0934, the P-38 sighted Yamamoto's formation. 2 pilots broke off to engage the lead Betty. The bomber hit in the wing section where fuel sat, began to burn and crashed in the jungle, taking Yamamoto's life. The scene is full of irony. A commander who had orchestrated long-range strikes fell victim to the very design that had enabled that reach. The death of Yamamoto had a psychological ripple. For the Allied side, it was an audacious success of intelligence and tactical execution. For Japan, it was a shock that cut deep, a strategist struck down by structural weakness. For the men who had labored to make the G4M, there was a bitter recognition that their machine could not protect even the highest command when fate and a better enemy alignment of intelligence and fighters intersected. 2 years later, another operation exposed the same flaw in a manner that was both desperate and tragic. On March 21, 1945, 18 G4Ms took off from Kanoya, each carrying an MXY-7OK under the fuselage, a piloted rocket with a 200-kilogram warhead intended as a guided kamikaze weapon. The Oka required the mother aircraft to bring it within about 20 kilometers of the target before release. Loaded with the Oka, the Bettys were slow, ungainly, and heavily burdened. American radar picked them up at long range. Fighters from USS Hornet, F-6F Hellcats, intercepted them well before they could reach release distance. The formation was destroyed before any Oka could be launched. 137 bomber crew members and 15 Oka pilots died. The mission encapsulates the tragic symmetry of strategy turned suicidal. Aircraft designed to reach distant sea lanes were turned into delivery systems for weapons they could not survive carrying. There are unexpected details that sharpen the moral of the story. The G4M's external stores, whether torpedoes or rocket bombs, added significant drag and reduced maneuverability. The choice to carry external weapons increased the chance that a single interceptor attack would find structural weakness or ignite vapor. Also, not every Betty burned instantly. Some limped home or were landed with severe damage when lucky. But those survivals were exceptions, not the rule. Another striking fact is that the G4M's vulnerability changed the way Allied pilots fought. Fighter units learned not merely to shoot, but to exploit the bomber's logistic and structural lines. Interception doctrines emphasized energy fighting and targeting of the center wing, methods that turned design parameters into tactical payoffs. The bookkeeping is cold but necessary. Across campaigns, Japanese aircrew losses in G4Ms ran into the thousands. Exact counts are difficult because of record loss and chaos in late war years, but the scale is unambiguous. A single 4th Air Group sortie on August 8, 1942, cost 18 bombers and approximately 120 aviators. By the end of Guadalcanal months later, hundreds of G4Ms had been lost across small campaigns. Production could not replace trained crews at the rate they died. Mitsubishi's factories at peak produced nearly 100 aircraft a month in 1943, but by 1944-45, Allied bombing, material shortages, and a shift to fighters reduced output dramatically. Japan's industrial rhythm could not keep pace with its strategic choices. Human stories make the ledger living. A line mechanic who spent nights fitting the last rivets watched newsreels of ships sinking and felt pride that his work mattered. Weeks later, he stood in a line where the relatives of a pilot collected a small bundle of effects. Engineers who once debated the weight of a rubber compound now read manifests of lost crews and felt a private responsibility that could not be absolved by technical justification. Families in port towns kept samples of the bomber, a bent fuel cap, a name tag, as proof that a son had existed and flown. This is the loser's perspective in its intimate form, not only strategic error, but a cultural and human tale of obligation, pride, miscalculation, and sorrow. The story of the G4M is therefore not only one of aerodynamics and production numbers, it is a study in how nations choose to measure risk and value. The Americans could absorb weight and complexity because their industrial base was vast. They could produce thousands of protected bombers and accept the cost in materials. Japan could not. The Japanese answer, maximize range, accept vulnerability, was rational in a particular context. That reasoned decision, however, collided with a reality the planners had underestimated. The enemy would adapt, and industrial and tactical shifts would transform vulnerability into catastrophe. That collision is the heart of a tragic arc. Decisions at a drafting table turned into lists of names. Fixes arrived, but too slowly. Bold missions demonstrated capability, then exposed weakness. In the end, the G4M's long shadow is not a single cause of defeat, but a stark example of what happens when a state's calculus prizes one dimension of power above the lives that serve it. The plane that could reach anywhere on a map also taught a harder lesson. Machines follow the logic engineers give them, but people live with the costs. By the time the last white-painted G4Ms lifted from Atsugi on August 19, 1945, the Betty's life was a closed circle of purpose and loss. Those two aircraft, bearing green crosses and the call signs Bataan 1 and Bataan 2, carried Japan's surrender delegates. The bomber that had opened a war at Clark Field in December 1941, that had sent torpedoes at Prince of Wales and Repulse, that had loomed across maps and nervously reshaped strategies, now crossed the same ocean to carry the words that would end hostilities. The image is painfully ironic. An instrument of reach returned as a vessel of capitulation. It is the kind of final image that presses on memory, asking us to hold contradictions without easy comfort. Look at the numbers, and then look at the faces. Mitsubishi produced roughly 2,400 G4Ms in all variants. The Model 1, the original long-range bomber, accounted for about 1,172 airframes. The Model 2 added roughly another 1,142 examples. The Model 3, which finally introduced self-sealing fuel tanks, arrived too late, and in too few numbers, perhaps 60 to 90 planes. Around 30 G4M airframes were converted into G6M transports used for personnel and diplomatic missions, including the White Surrender aircraft. Peak production reached near 100 aircraft per month in 1943, a pace remarkable for Japan's constrained industrial base. Yet output could not replace losses, and numbers alone do not tell the story of the men who filled those craft. Losses were not just statistics on a ledger. They were mothers who received a telegram with a single line. They were small villages where a son's futon remained unused. They were mechanics who tightened the last rivet and later learned the name of the pilot who would not return. Records are incomplete, but the pattern is unmistakable. In some battles, Entire crews were consumed in fire that left little to bury. The Guadalcanal campaign alone saw hundreds of G4Ms lost and hundreds of aircrew casualties. The August 8, 1942 mission that cost 18 of 23 Bettys and about 120 aviators is only one of many moments where the arithmetic of design and doctrine became a tally of grief. Compare the Japanese choices to Allied doctrine and production to understand how these losses became decisive. American industry produced thousands more heavy bombers, over 12,000 B-17s and many more B-24s, and accepted a design philosophy that added weight in exchange for protection, armor, self-sealing tanks, redundancy. The United States could afford the weight penalty because its industrial capacity could deliver huge numbers of aircraft and because it regarded trained crews as an asset to be preserved. Japan lacked similar scale and raw materials. The decision made in Nagoya in the late 1930s to trade protective weight for fuel and range was rational within a particular strategic frame. It is not the point to cast it as simple folly. It was a choice shaped by geography, assumptions about the speed of conflict and limits of supply. But choices have consequences, and the consequence here was a consistent pattern of flight missions that often ended in conflagration. We must also hold the context of culture and command. In wartime Japan, there was a powerful ethic of duty, obedience, and sacrifice. Pilots and crew accepted heightened risk because their society and their military asked them to accept it. That acceptance does not erase responsibility. It complicates moral judgment. The men who drew specifications, who ordered materials, who signed requisitions, they were part of systems that valued certain ends over certain lives. Engineers who studied in Germany and technicians in Nagoya were not blind. They understood the trade-offs. They did their work with competence and with belief that they served a national cause. But belief and competence intersect with limited resources and political choices. The result was planes that fulfilled the letter of specifications while leaving human protection as a casualty of those specifications. There are haunting personal lines in this story. A line mechanic wrote of polishing a fuselage and thinking of a newborn he had not yet held. A pilot tucked a simple paper with his name and instructions to family in the cockpit. A mother in a small coastal town kept a scrap of fuel tank skin as a last token. Masao Sato's blunt confession that the Betty was a magnificent aircraft that asked us to die for its range is not rhetoric. It is testimony. Testimony requires us to listen. When we listen, the narrative shifts from military analysis to human account. We begin to see that the cost of a strategic choice is measured in human lives and the private aftermath they leave. The G4M's arc also forces broader reflection about how nations make choices in crisis. States with abundant resources can choose to protect lives by absorbing costs in production and materials. States under material and strategic pressure may place different priorities on range and offensive capability. Those decisions reflect not only material constraints, but also political imagination. How leaders visualize threat, how they forecast duration, how they value human life relative to strategic gain. In the 1930s, Japanese planners thought in terms of battles of movement, rapid strikes, and decisive blows. They underestimated the enemy's capacity to adapt, to scale production, and to close gaps in the air. The result was a slow attrition that Japan could not sustain. What does this mean for how we remember the war and its victims? It means remembering beyond victory and defeat, beyond maps and medals. It means seeing that the losers were not only command failures or numbers, they were fathers, brothers, mechanics, pilots, and the families who survived them. Memory should not flatten complexity into simple moralizing. Instead, remembrance should hold both the engineering brilliance and the ethical weight of the choices that shaped lives. Empathy does not condone errors. It humanizes those who made them and those who paid for them. Today, when we look at a stripped wing in a museum or a black and white photograph of a burning bomber, we must ask what those images ask of us now. Do we accept that war will always reduce human beings to variables on a sheet? Or do we insist on ethical limits that place human life at the center of military reasoning? These are not abstract questions. They touch procurement, doctrine, and the culture of institutions that still, in different forms, make choices about what to protect and what to risk. If there is a final lesson in the Betty story, it is twofold. Technically, a machine does exactly what its designers tell it to do. If the design tells it to carry fuel for extraordinary range, it will do that and nothing more. Morally, human life cannot be wholly reduced to design trade-offs without cost. The men who flew and built the Betty believed, when with courage and conviction, that their sacrifice had meaning. History shows how that meaning was tested and in many instances found wanting. If this account has moved you, if it has made you feel the faces behind the machines and the weight of choices made under pressure, please take a moment now. Subscribe to this channel to follow more stories that look squarely at the human side of history. Like the video if you believe remembering the losers and the hard questions of war matters. Leave a comment with your questions, reflections, or family stories. You may share anonymously if you prefer. Your voice helps keep the memory of those who were asked to pay the hardest price alive, and it brings more nuance to how we judge the past. In remembering, we do a small, necessary justice to those who flew in the Bettys and to the families who lived long after the engines fell silent.